Episode 9 saw the Skywalker saga conclude with Ben Solo sacrificing himself to bring Rey back to life. From here, Rey would carry the Skywalker legacy, finally living her life without the dark shadow of her grandfather looming over her every move. But Ben's sacrifice, while admirable, robs us of the mystical dyad in the Force, the powerful bond between Rey and Ben, riddled with potential that we had only just begun to discover. So what if Ben Solo survived the rise of Skywalker? What would he have done? Where would he have gone? What would Rey want? What would Ben want? How would the galaxy handle Ben's return, or would they even know about it at all? In this video, we will explore what could have happened if the last descendant of Anakin Skywalker had walked away from the Battle of Exegol rather than becoming a Force ghost as his mother guided him home. Red 5 was in the air. Rey had defeated the Emperor, and she was alive and well, ready to head back to the Resistance base with the rest of the fleet. And as the vast collection of ships slowly departed, an injured man sat in an old TIE fighter from a time long past. His ship remained on the ground, not welcome to fly alongside the rebels, certainly not without being questioned. And questions were the last thing Ben Solo needed right now, not because he wasn't prepared to answer for his past, but because of his current physical condition, and because in reality, there were no answers anyone would want to hear. It didn't matter to anyone else how he'd gotten to where he was or who pulled what strings to get him there. This was his life. His choices were his to deal with and his to answer for. He understood that, but now was not the time. After the last of the ships had left Exegol's atmosphere, Ben fired up the TIE's engines and went in search of medical attention. Using his own credentials, Ben Solo would gain easy access to a First Order medical facility. He would still be recognized as Kylo Ren by the ship's crew members. He knew that, but he found it challenging to front as the Supreme Leader now. It was as if Kylo Ren truly had died, and Ben Solo was a different man altogether. Assuming the alias of Kylo was uncomfortable for him, Ben would seek assistance from droids, confronting human life only when he had no other choice. His ankle would be set back in place and given a splint to keep it there. His several broken ribs would be repaired. The internal bleeding caused by said injuries would be stopped. Ben would find food, the medications he needed, and then he would leave once again, never to return to this place or any other like it. Now he would take a new ship, cruising back out into the unknown. Rey's X-Wing landed at the Resistance base, where she would join the celebration over their unlikely victory. She looked happy and relieved to see her friends, but Finn saw something else, something beneath the surface. Rey was distracted, almost like she was still waiting for something. He would let her be for right now. This was a happy moment, a moment to rejoice and to celebrate, but Rey had been through a lot. Perhaps some space would do her well. Rey sat down alone among her books and artifacts and looked up at the sky, wondering, waiting, and waiting. She'd spent 13 years on Jakku doing nothing but waiting. She looked down. Her knee was bouncing. Her hands were fidgety. She was nervous. "I'll be right behind you." That's what Ben had told her before she'd left him behind. He was so happy. Happy to begin his next journey, she'd thought at the time, but now she realized he wasn't happy for himself, and why would he be? None of these people would accept him if they knew who he really was. Ben had been happy for Rey, happy he'd been able to give her back to the galaxy. Nothing that happened on Exegol had been about him. He did it for everyone else, for his parents, for everyone he'd ever wronged, and most of all, he did it for her. Ben stood atop a tall hill of sand, blown into his family's homestead by the winds of Tatooine. He'd been here once before. It felt a bit less dead back then, but it was all the same, more or less. There was a surprisingly intricate home out here in the middle of the desert, and then there was sand. Miles upon miles of sand, miles deep and miles as far as the eye could see. He didn't really know why he was here, just didn't have anywhere else to go, and this place felt safe. He explored the home for a while, taking note of the living conditions and how they'd compared to his own. As the sun began to set, he went back outside, plopped down in the sand, and watched until it was dark. Days would pass, and Ben would remain at the homestead. He was alone. He had nowhere else to go, and so he stayed here. He tidied the place up a bit, fixed the shifter on an old speeder, and spoke to an elderly woman who asked for his name, smiled, and then carried on. There was something oddly comforting about this place for Ben. It was quiet here, free of the constant pressures he'd endured for most of his life, both as a Jedi and with the First Order. He knew he couldn't stay here forever, nor did he want to, but Ben was alone in this galaxy. He stepped outside early the next morning and began walking to his ship to see if he could catch any news reports about what was going on out there, but he slowed to a stop as he approached another figure standing in his path. It was his uncle, outlined by a faint blue silhouette. Ben was surprised, but given what he'd been through the last few days, he wasn't completely shocked to see Luke here. He spoke first. "I was wondering when you were gonna show up." Luke smirked, remembering his last words to Ben at the Battle of Crate. But Luke was here for a more serious conversation. Ben had come a long way since they'd last met, and there was still plenty more he would need to do, but this was no way to live. Anakin hadn't been granted the opportunity Ben had now, and Luke wasn't going to let his nephew waste it. He had his whole life in front of him. Luke would remind Ben of a certain woman, not that he hadn't thought about her every day, but Rey believed in Ben Solo. She always had, and now she was counting on him, waiting for him. Was he really going to let her down again? Rey was Ben's way forward. Whether he believed it or not, there were people out there who could use Ben's help. Not just Rey, there was a whole galaxy of people out there still scrambling to take advantage of the massive swing the war had just taken. A battle had been won, yes, the most important battle there was at that, but the fight was not over. What Ben had to decide now was if he was going to write the rest of his story, or if he was going to let the galaxy decide his fate. Back at the Resistance base, a large group of rebels sat around a fire, discussing the Battle of Exegol. Everyone had been so caught up in their own experiences the last few days that no one had really gotten Rey's full story of what she went through. All anyone really knew was that Rey had defeated Palpatine, but today she would be put on the spot, asked directly what had happened within the confines of the Sith Temple. Rey would explain that she'd gone to confront the Emperor and been met with a force she would not have defeated on her own, but that someone, a friend, an ally, had come to her aid, and that together they had defeated Palpatine and his guards, along with the Knights of Ren. Curiosity about who this friend was abundant, but someone would chime in upon Rey's mention of the Knights, wondering aloud where their leader, Kylo, had been during all of this, and if he was still out there. Rey would quickly assure them that Kylo Ren had died before the Battle of Exegol, and then she would excuse herself before any more questions could arise. Finn followed Rey, asking her if she was okay, and then following up on the story she'd just shared. He too was curious about this friend. Rey paused, locking eyes with Finn as she considered whether she could tell him the truth. Finn was her friend, her best friend, and she'd kept him in the dark about so many things over the past year. She owed him the truth. On this night, Finn would hear the full story. Kylo Ren was gone, from a certain point of view. It was Ben Solo who'd stood with Rey on Exegol, who'd risked his own life to bring her back from the dead, and who was now on the run from a galaxy he knew would never accept him. The story would upset Finn. It would downright scare him, but he would promise to keep the story between he and Rey. The two would part ways for the night in the hopes of getting some sleep, although neither one of them would find much success. In the morning, just as the sun began to peek through the trees, an urgent meeting was called for. It was Rose who would share the news, sharing footage of First Order troopers raiding a heavily populated city as a Star Destroyer loomed overhead. She would explain that 3 other attacks just like this one had taken place over the last 24 hours. The Final Order had been put to rest before it saw the light of day, but remnants of the First Order clearly remained. 3 of the 4 assaults had resulted in complete planetary takeover for the First Order, but at the 4th one, something interesting happened. Drone footage showed troopers forcefully taking the capital city, but as they progressed, a tall man with a dark cloak standing in the road suddenly came into view. His words could not be made out by the footage, but he was clearly issuing some sort of warning. And as the troopers began to fire upon him, a blue lightsaber bursted to life. Hundreds of lasers closed on him, one round after another, but the figure evaded all of them with impeccable precision. He deflected many with his saber, ducked out of the way of others, and redirected the rest, using the Force in a way that all but one individual at this meeting had never witnessed before. The man pressed forward, disarming one soldier after another, appearing even to freeze some of them in place. He killed no one, but he left all of them defenseless, unable to continue their bombardment. In just minutes, the entire city had been freed, but it wasn't over yet. The starship looming overhead reared its cannons, preparing to fire on the city. As it did, the hooded warrior put his lightsaber away, lowering his head in concentration. Aboard the Star Destroyer, the ship's commander stood, surveying the battleground, prepared to give the order, but he suddenly paused, his mind being taken over by a power he couldn't understand, by a force he'd been told was there, but one he could never begin to feel. And just like that, he had no control over his own mind. His orders would take everyone by surprise. Stand down. "Tell the troopers to surrender their weapons. We've lost. The war is over." The commander's crew would think to question him at first, but suddenly their intentions shifted as well. Nothing taking place on the destroyer could be seen by the drone footage, but the implications of this hero's actions were clear. The Resistance fighters gathered around the table watched in awe as the destroyer began a slow descent toward the planet's surface. Rey looked up at Finn, who had already been staring at her for several seconds. She prepared to speak, but another alarm sounded on the holotable, signaling reports of another attack taking place not far from the planet they were currently on. These weren't just a few isolated attacks, this was the enemy's final stand. Palpatine was dead, but the embers of his legacy still burned. The Resistance needed to act now.